Hi, this is a video to Ruth Serwotka. It's not an aggro video, although your culture generally takes any injury to your identity as that. But I'm really sorry we can't manage the Labour left's identity at the moment. I don't know if you saw the Welfare Weekly today. The NFY has come up with about 100,000 deaths from ESA alone. Now, once this period is finished, one of the biggest tasks that's going to be awaiting us is counting the deaths and trying to establish them and trying to establish methodology so that we can kind of trace how many people have died in the last 8 years, and the numbers are quite significant. We're not talking a few hundred deaths, we're not talking a couple of thousand. You know, we could be looking at 6-7 figures. Now, welfare reform and local authority reform was subject to absolute political consensus throughout this time, which you are fully aware of, and I am fully aware of. And I cannot pretend that that's not the case, and nor can anybody else anymore. Now, one of the difficulties that I know you have is that you have given your life to a political movement. And you have believed in it, genuinely. I understand that. But unfortunately, the political movement you have given your life to has just shown that elite social closure has taken over the power of Labour itself. You know, PCS as a route to the likes of Owen Jones getting a media career. And, and the consequence of PCS running to the left-wing identity rather than representing the politically neutral civil servants and service users in those institutions is that we don't have solutions to our welfare problems. Nobody knows how those systems work. And the fundamental dysfunction in our political economy is the barrier created by the Labour movement, which you're currently playing out on Twitter. Now, there is absolutely no possible way that you could believe that welfare reform was not subject to political consensus, because those welfare cuts were still in the last Labour manifesto. So you know this to be true now. You know that I am telling you that you know this, I know this. Ruth, the situation when you've got 100,000 bodies at least, and you're looking at 10 years of trying to trace dead people and count numbers, by the time the pile of bodies is that big, we can't prioritise your identity. So I am using this video to quite literally beg you. I am begging you directly, really, to start putting your political identity aside and to stop prioritising the political identity of the Labour movement over these people. Because the reality is that in 2010, our trade unions should have been offering the critique that's in that playlist that I had to do. And I've just had to do that on my own. And for 8 years, I've been abused relentlessly because people wanted me to discuss left or right, because this political culture didn't know that this is always subject to welfare reform. When you try to derail discussion of welfare reform into the mean old Tories, I appreciate you're only doing that out of habit because of your political identity. But we have now reached a point where when you do that, you are very deliberately disenfranchising people. And when you've got a body count in 6 figures at least, it's time to stop. Now, I know that you and Karen and your peers do not like having your identity injured by people like me. But in 2010, the rule of law was undermined for looked after children, for single parents, for people on disability benefits, for people who were signing on. And we thought our trade union, that PCS, the union that I had been on strike with, the union I have been a rep with, we thought they would discuss this. And instead they spent 8 years preventing that discussion. Unison, as you're aware, said some cuts were okay as long as it was the completely undeliverable cuts. And that was the very most vulnerable people in the country. I am not connected to your political movement, Ruth. I am connected to those people. Now, Our trade unions, who have taken our money for years, just spent 8 years actively preventing us discussing welfare reform, while 100,000 people died. Karen, women's ability to leave abuse was removed. The family courts were used to mandate them into abuse, and their kids were removed. We don't even know how many women and how many children. The time has come for you both to reflect on your identity, and to understand that when you protect your identity by continuing to try and derail discussion of these things into that political identity, that you are actively harming people. Now, you're so distant from the people that you're harming that you don't see it as harm, and I understand that. I understand to you this is Twitter. But that was our political representation. That was those people's political representation. I know that Karen thinks it's a Twitter spat when she has a temper tantrum to tell Yvette Cooper, and I know that everybody on Twitter just thinks this is me being difficult. But actually, we've now got to start coming up with methodology to possibly count 6, 7 figures of a death toll. And that's going to be work for the next 10 or 11 years. The self-ID crisis has emerged as a consequence of us being unable to deal with that then. It's a consequence of the same factors: economic discipline, media democracy, and it's the same forces. And what the self-ID crisis does is it forces recognition of those systems, the systems that were not represented from 2010 to 2018. Trans rights activists have asked for a conversation about safeguarding. They have asked for a conversation about those systems, and that's where we're going to get acknowledgement of them. The self-ID crisis is about women's rights. We were not allowed to stand up for them 2010 to 2018. And this is that. Now, I know that you are both well-intentioned. I know you both identify as good, and I know you have both had long careers where you have not had to consider the impact of that identity. And I know that social media is the first time where that has happened. And I know you think that I'm just being rude. I know you think I'm just being argumentative when I ask you to stop derailing discussion of the self-ID crisis into the Labour left. Because the Labour left, the only thing, you need to understand that the only thing that the Labour left have managed to do in the last 8 years is demonstrate that they have upheld the neoliberal consensus since 1983, that within rigid institutional structures in the Labour Party, you've been going round and round and round in circles, performing a protective seal. You've demonstrated that elite social closure has taken the power of Labour itself. And for 8 years, trade unions have actively, openly, publicly, confidently prevented discussion of consensus on these policies. The time has come to put your identity aside. I really was delighted by what you did, Ruth. I know how difficult it is to go up against your culture. I know how much balls that takes, and I admire that. I admire many things that you have done. I admire that you got Women's Place UK on the road all over the country. I admire that you managed to get that campaign for local authorities clarifying their sex-based protections was fucking inspired. But you are going to have to understand that you cannot ask women to stand shoulder to shoulder with you while you're stood on their throats. And every time you try to derail discussion of welfare reform and local authority reform into the mean old Tories, that's what you're doing. And that's how we experience it. Now, the reflection on identity that I'm talking about is normal in these systems. It is not normal in your political culture, and it's going to have to get normal. But right now, all that has to happen to break a consensus that's been upheld for the last 30 years is all that has to happen is women have to be heard. They have to be allowed to speak, and they have to be heard. And then that consensus is over. It's been over for about 5-6 years. But in order to end that consensus, we have to acknowledge what it was, which is a consensus. And we have to acknowledge that that welfare reform had massive public support, and that our trade unions assisted in preventing people from discussing it for 8 years. And the reason we have to acknowledge that is because we desperately need to discuss it now. We need to discuss that equality was rolled back, and the self-ID crisis is demanding recognition of those systems. It's not harmless when you say that that was just the right. It's a lie. In 2010, I could pretend that you wouldn't know that. In 2018, we can't pretend anymore. It's a lie, and it has to stop. And every time you tell people, or you use the massive resources that you have with Women's Place UK to prevent discussion of that political consensus, because you want to tell yourselves that it was just the mean old Tories, you are directly harming us. I wanted to come to the Women's Place UK meeting in Leeds, but I can't. I just can't. I don't know whether this will get through to you. I don't know whether you understand how serious this is. I don't know whether you understand that the game has changed, or whether you just perceive this video as somebody trying to get at you. The fact is, I don't know you. And I don't know Karen and Gala Smith, and I don't know any of these people, and I am not connected to them by anything but Twitter and the fact that I found out some people identified as my representation, and that's why I don't have a trade union, and why I didn't have a trade union. Now, when I realised the left were going to prevent that discussion, I had it anyway. And I've kind of made the connection with LSE so that they understand this. And they do. At the core of the Inequalities Institute, they do understand this now. And that's done. I'm not saying this to get at you. I'm not saying this to attack you. I'm saying this because we need to start to address 100,000 dead people. And because we can't manage your identity at the same time. I've fully supported Women's Place UK from the beginning, but now I can't go to those meetings. Because it's been made clear to me that those meetings are about preventing discussion of that. And the women using Women's Place UK, all attending, they might not know that that was subject to consensus. And they think they're there to stand up for these systems. But in order to stand up for these systems, you are going to have to put your left-wing identity aside. And you are going to have to recognise that PCS and Unison are actually directly in the frame for directly disenfranchising these people. And in the 8 years where they should have been discussing what's going on in those institutions, they were instead playing out a labour movement psychodrama. Now, I'm not going to do anything. I haven't got any power. You're likely to go... The labour movement are going to go round in circles until this is addressed. I don't care. I really don't care anymore. I do care that we have to figure out methodology to count, 100,000, to identify how many people have died in the last 8 years. And I do know that we can't do that while you are throwing your firepower at preventing that discussion. And it's time to stop. It is time to recognise that it has to stop. You have our trade unions, you have our political party, you have media power. You cannot use this crisis to prevent people discussing political consensus, and you cannot throw your enormous resources at this on the condition that people can only discuss it if they manage your identity, not when there's a pile of corpses that big at stake. I stand shoulder to shoulder. I don't need anything from you. I don't need anything from Karen. I fully support Women's Place UK. But I cannot stand with someone who is actively preventing me from addressing this. The choice is yours, and the choice is that of your peers, and I understand that as far as you're concerned, casting someone out like me is not a problem. It doesn't matter to you. I understand that that's very likely. I understand that your class tend to reproduce power structures around themselves regardless of the consequences. But the consequences now have been great.